Cybercrimes, there's lots of headlines about cybercrime and all these companies are being affected, and 633 attempts a day, and all into most UK companies, and that there's a proliferation of cybercrimes. And in 2015, the National Crime Survey introduced cybercrime as one of its categories, and you may remember the headlines from those years ago showing that crime doubled overnight was the headline, but actually that's because cybercrime was included for the first time. So around half of all crime is considered cybercrime. So in terms of the kind of, it's not maybe the best terminology, but a website called Data Breach is logging all these different cybercrimes, and they're calling them kind of winners each month. So they've kind of gone through each month about the major cyber attacks, which ones have affected the most people, and hopefully you can see here that it's kind of international, and tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of users are getting affected by cybercrime. So there's literally hundreds of millions of people each month are getting affected. Cybercrime are impacting upon their lives. So within the popular media, within the UK at least, there's an association with autism and cybercrime. There's been some very high-profile extradition cases for on the spectrum, and the US have tried to attempt to extradite them to the US from the UK. The resultant and emergent autism has then been the reason why they've been denied that extradition. So it's a relatively small number of cases, but it's very prevalent with the public of this some potential association between autism and cybercrime. So the reason that I find this concerning is we know that autistic people find it very difficult to get employment of any kind. Use of employment for autistic people is within the world of cyber and doing digital things. So if this association were to be made between autism and cybercrime, that could have a very negative impact upon the job opportunities of autistic people if people are thinking, well, are they cyber? But actually, the employees are waking up to the fact that autistic people potentially can have a skill set that's particularly useful for tech-oriented jobs. So that's not to imply by any means that every autistic person is great at computers and needs a, but maybe some of them are. And that autistic employees can give companies an edge. And so there are companies out there now that are seeking to look at autistic employees, which is great, and we wouldn't want that derailed by anecdotal accounts of associations between autism and cybercrime. So as I mentioned before, we have a summer school with JP Morgan to highlight that again. So if you know of any, and this is a graduate program, so if you know of any students on the spectrum who might need some additional coaching and looking for employment, we do run this with JP Morgan. The world's biggest banks, and they are looking to target autistic people and find out how they can best support them through the process of application to encourage them and make their organization autism friendly. So in addition to that, to introduce the concept of autistic-like traits. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, I'll just quickly go over that. And autistic-like traits are argued to be this population-based continuum of through self-report questionnaires such as the AQ that Baron Cohen has developed in Cambridge. And there are questions such as these. If you can see them, I often notice small sounds when others do not, and getting into social issues as well. Address these kind of skills around social skills, the ability to focus your attention, your capacity for communication or imagination. And a higher autistic trait score means you have more behaviors. So it's not diagnostic at all, but when you give out this questionnaire, the AQ10 has 10 items, the full AQ has 50 items. You tend to get distributions like this, the questionnaire to the general population. You get an average kind of around this point, but you'll see there are some members of the general population who have very high autistic traits. Now, on average, autistic people, higher levels, with the solid line here, is autistic people. So on average, they tend to have higher levels of autistic-like traits, but you can see there are also some people who are autistic who have lower levels of autistic-like traits. So it's not diagnostic, but at a autistic people tend to have more higher levels of autistic-like traits than non-autistic people. And Lundqvist looked at, okay, well, let's take people who are high in autistic traits, but how do they differ from people who are high in autistic traits and do have autism? And they found that of the 50 items, actually they were very similar on 45 of the items, but actually there are some slight differences. So the autistic group endorsed more, I'd rather go to a library than a party, I'm fascinated by numbers, and I find it hard to make. Whereas this was endorsed more by the non-ASD group, was I find it making up stories easy and I enjoy social situations. So they were the difference between the high autistic traits group who did have autism and the high autistic trait group who didn't have autism. But on the other 45 items, they were all very, there is a strong overlap between autistic-like traits and autism, but they are separate entities. So we can conceptualize that kind of way to suggest people often talk about a spectrum, an autism spectrum, and use the term autism spectrum disorder, but there's also a continuum of autistic-like traits. And what the relationship is between these is still open, but that you can have autistic people and that you can have non-autistic people, some of whom have autistic-like traits as well. And the reason this is interesting is because high levels of autistic-like traits, and sometimes associated with strengths in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, which is now getting us onto that kind of technology side of things. Embarrassing Bodies. Have you seen Embarrassing Bodies? I don't know why it was Embarrassing Bodies that did the survey, but they invited the general population, so they got millions of people to complete this AQ to find out, I mean, literally millions. They found that those with the highest levels of autistic-like traits were those in scientific and technical professions. So those with good technical skills tended to have high levels of autistic-like traits. And people in social negotiation type of skills, those kind of jobs, they had the lowest levels of autistic-like traits. So any association could be challenging between autism and cybercrime based on anecdotal evidence. And generally, that's not what the literature suggests anyway. If you look generally at the literature, it identifies autistic employees within companies tend to be seen as particularly trustworthy, loyal, and reliable. And there's to suggest that compared to the typical population, autistic people tend to be more law-abiding. So any sense between a relationship between autism and cybercrime is kind of challenging the actual research, which suggests the opposite is true. Autistic people, if anything, are less likely to commit crimes. So the crime we're particularly looking at is called cyberdependent. Now, cyber-dependent crime is separated from something called cyber-enabled crime. So just to get over this distinction, so cybercrime is the illegal use of technology to commit a crime. But cyber-dependent crimes are crimes that have technology to do them, such as hacking. So there wasn't hacking prior to the advent of technologies such as websites and the internet, because there was nothing to hack, and it's dependent upon the technology. There's also cyber-enabled crimes, and that might be something like an online fraud. Dear beloved, you've inherited £1 million, please send me your bank details and I'll put the money in, but actually they then rob you blind. But those kind of frauds have always been happening, it's just now they're in a new format. So if you were to get prosecuted under that, you'll be prosecuted. Whereas the cyber-dependent crimes are things such as hacking and what's called DDoSing, or the distributed denial of service, where you can almost like attack a server and stop it functioning. So it's the cyber-dependent crimes that the cybercrime unit of the National Crime Agency focus upon, because the cyber-enabled crimes like fraud is dealt with by the fraud squad. So the National Crime Agency asked us to look at cyber-dependent crimes. So there's one looking at cybercrime and autism. Ledington and Mills, they interviewed law enforcement agencies from 7 different countries across the world, and they report anecdotally that they are investigating autistic-like, apparently autistic people within the people who are perpetrating cyber-dependent crime. So they anecdotally report that the National Crime Agency, they'll see a hack is going on, and they'll come bursting in and grab a computer, and there's just a 15-year-old boy sitting there looking rather shocked that someone's kicked his door in, as are the parents downstairs who've got no idea what's going on. So the National Crime Agency tend to get involved when crimes are serious, to get a sentence of 3 years or more. And you can get up to life in prison now for cybercrime, or 10-year sentences in theory. So it's considered a very serious crime, and most people facing 10 years have a long track record of crime increasing in severity. Whereas the National Crime Agency are reporting they are now getting a very group large young males who they report apparently demonstrating autism-like characteristics as they're kicking in the doors and they're finding these kind of socially awkward young males sitting at terminals. There's an apparent association between autism and cybercrime. And that's what, as a consistent pattern that's being reported by law enforcement agencies across the 7 countries. However, Leddington and Mills are saying that's evidence other than the anecdotal accounts of the law enforcement agency. So everything here is speculative. So the National Crime Agency partnered with Barclays, who had a view of course, if you can prevent access, the other way to go is cybersecurity. So there are lots of people who have got an investment in let's prevent cybercrime and try and reorientate towards a more cybersecurity kind. Okay, so they said, can we take the first empirical look and start looking at what these relationships might be? So is there a direct link between autistic-like traits or autism and cybercrime? Well, you think, well, given what we know of the law-abiding nature that the research is suggesting that's associated with autism, that might seem. But maybe there's an indirect link. Maybe there's some association between this sense of autistic-like traits and an interest in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics that makes you more in these the skills required to commit cybercrime. As if I wanted to commit a violent crime, I could do that right now. I could go up and punch somebody. I won't. I could go up and punch somebody right now. I have the capacity potentially to do that. But if I wanted to go and hack a website, I couldn't because I don't know how to do it. So you do need a certain level of technological expertise to be able to commit these crimes. So maybe it's the case that if you're orientated towards computer science and technology, it's just the case that you have the skill set required, therefore devices might be coming in. As autism or higher levels of autistic traits are associated with lower levels of social support, maybe that's an influence. You don't have a social support network saying, well, you really shouldn't be hacking into that or DDoSing that kind of. Or maybe the other aspect is a compromised theory of mind. If you can't think of the consequences of how this behavior might be affecting other people and this kind of theory of mind type issues, maybe that would be an issue. So we took those threads from the thought, well, okay, let's try and assess them and look at autistic-like traits. So what we tested when we were looking for a social cognition was what's called the Dewey test, explicit social cognition. So this is just an example where you have to identify the extent to which you think a behavior is kind of normal or not. So you might have a scenario like, I overslept this morning. When I woke up, there was just enough time to dress, skip breakfast. You think, well, how normal do you think that is? And we say, well, yeah, I think it's fairly normal to do. And then you might say, well, by noon I was starving, but I had no money with me. Across the aisle, a young child was complaining about her food, saying, I can't eat it. Apparently the father didn't want the food either because he told the child to just leave it. I leaned across the aisle and said, if your child doesn't want her food, can you pass it over for me? How normal is that? So what it's trying to get to is, to what extent are you attuned with social norms? So you give this out to, hundreds of thousands of people, and then you can give it to autistic people as well, or people high on whether they give the same sort of, yeah, the first one I would do, the second one is a little bit unusual. So that's the kind of assessment for explicit social cognition that we used. So the study I'm going to tell you about today, 75 people, and they were recruited from schools, universities, and the general populations, inviting people to take part in a study looking at online activity, including illegal online activity. And we asked them for 3 the demographics, like their age and their sex and that kind of thing, a range of psychological variables, but also computer-related experience. So I'll just go over those 3. So the demographics, we were asking whether they were male or female, who responded to our survey. The average age range, so you can see it was a full age range from 14 to 74, but on average, the people answering were about 24. And also, we gave a brief IQ test to show that actually, 10 out of 12, quite a high level of IQ, majority of males, although there are quite a few females there, aged around 24 to characterize the sample. In terms of the psychological variables that we asked, we gave out the questionnaire of autistic-like quite a good spread there. We gave the explicit cognition test, and again, there's a good range of explicit cognition, so that's the example I gave you earlier, it was one of those. And then also, we tapped into social support and gave out that questionnaire to see whether social support might also be a factor that related to illegal online activities. Computer-related experience, do you have basic skills, like can you download a file from the internet? But then do you have advanced computer-dependent skills? And these are the skills that you really would require if you're going to engage in some kind of cyber activity. And then we asked, have you done any of these kind of list of cyber-dependent crimes? So we weren't really interested if there were sex differences or age differences. So if we controlled for those, what we wanted to see was there a relationship variables and the computer experience variables. And we found yes. Lo and behold, as you can see, the higher the level of your autistic-like traits, then the higher your basic skills and the illegal activities that you engaged in. So the more autistic-like skills you were endorsing, the more of all the computer activities you were involved in. There was also a relationship between the more difficult social cognition, again, that related to having higher levels of advanced computer-like skills. So it looked like there were some relationships in there that was worth exploring. So we then looked at those who did report having engaged in one or more and those who didn't, to see where were the differences in those variables. And the differences between those who did and didn't engage were in, again, AQ score, those who reported one or more illegal activities, or higher levels of autistic-like traits than those who didn't. And they also had higher levels of advanced digital skills. So there were two features going on there. It was more autistic traits and more skills. We wanted to tease out from those, is it the autistic-like traits or is it the higher level of skills? And there's a complex statistical way of trying to partial out and answer that question, which gives you a model like this. But basically, yes, autistic-like traits do predict illegal digital activity. There is a direct effect. And there's also an indirect effect in that autistic-like traits also relate and predict advanced digital activity, which in turn predict illegal digital activity. And it's about half and half. So there seems to be a direct relationship between higher levels of autistic-like traits and cyber-dependent crime, but also an indirect effect. High levels of autistic-like traits relate to greater level of computer-dependent skill set, which in turn enables you to engage in illegal digital activity. So this is the first evidence. Higher autistic traits in the general population relates to cyber-dependent crime, directly and indirectly. And we also know, of course, as I said at the very beginning, that autistic people tend to be higher in autistic life. So you might infer from that, so autistic people are more likely to engage in cyber-dependent crime. But no, because within our sample, we had 10 autistic people also answer the questionnaire. So 165 of them came from the general population, but we had 10 from the autistic population. So the numbers are small. We're only looking at 10 autistic people, but significantly so, they were in the not commit a cybercrime category. Statistically significantly, numbers are small, but the trend is, the significant trend is that autistic people, and again, the caveats are, of course, that it's self-report, but autistic people are not engaging in cybercrime, whereas people with high autistic traits who do not have autism, that's what's. So as we said, there are these two groups. There's the high autistic trait, and you can either have autism or not, and it suggests that those with high autistic traits who don't have autism, that's what's correlating with cyber-dependent crime. Those with high autistic traits and autism, it's almost suggesting likely to engage in cybercrime. So actually, these are the people, they've got the skill set needed to work in that cyber environment, but they're not motivated into that criminal activity. So in many ways, that's the ideal profile. You want the people with high autistic traits who also have autism. Of course, that's very speculative at this stage. It's the first study, and it's small numbers, but I think that gives potentially a very message. We also asked questions of the anyone ever approached you to commit cybercrime and you didn't? So 29%, 29, which is 17% of people, had been approached to engage in a cybercrime by a third party and had declined. Well, what reasons? Why didn't you? And you can see here there are what we've got here is the AQ score, the autistic traits of those who gave the different types of answers. And those highest levels of autistic-like traits gave the answers along as well. It was too complicated. I wasn't being offered enough money. They were giving those kind of answers for not having engaged in cybercrime if they had very high traits. Those had kind of lower levels of saying, well, it's morally wrong, it's illegal, the lower level traits. But those, again, not autistic, the non-autistic people with high levels of autistic traits were giving kind of practical, they didn't offer me enough money kind of answers. Done it. Final part of the analysis, also through the National Crime Agency, 7 people who had been convicted for cyber-dependent crimes came forward and also did the same questionnaire. Again, its numbers are very small to see how they compare with our big sample of 175. And they undertook an analysis, and they were interviewed by Katie Louise about their cyber criminal activities and kind of what it. And she came up with a model like this about the motivations that they had given. Now, again, there are lots of ethics about inviting people to give post hoc accounts had engaged in this criminal behaviour, and there may be some kind of post hoc rationalisation processing going on, but it's all anonymous. They've done their time, they've been caught, so there's no benefit for them of lying at any point. But we have to take on board there might be motivations for why these 7 in particular chose to speak to us. So they gave these series of different motivations for engaging in cybercrime, which I shall just run through. But firstly, just to say, it wasn't that they just had one. Everyone had one of the answers. We have all the different types of reasons that I'm going to go through in a moment. And that's participant 1. So participant 1 gave 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, gave 5 reasons why they'd engaged in cybercrime. And participant 2 had other reasons they'd engaged in cybercrime. So you can see it wasn't the case that everyone just had one, that actually when you asked them, there's a whole of different reasons that were being presented for engaging in cybercrime. So I shall now just go over what they were, finally. But if we remember that most people were giving more than one. So the first one of those that you can see at the top there is the lack of understanding. And what we've got here is the overarching aim, and there were sort of sub-themes within that, which are in the coloured boxes, and they're quotes here. So I don't propose to read through them all. They're in your slides if you want to read them. But the first and overarching was that kind of lack of understanding of what the consequences might be of having engaged in cybercrime. Actually, it turns out it's not so funny when the agency are kicking down your door, and there are some very serious consequences of going on, and your parents are being involved. I didn't expect it to be such a big hassle for everyone. So this kind of lack of understanding of how serious cybercrime can be. And as I say, the laws are now the maximum sentence is actually life imprisonment if it's considered serious enough, your hacking events. So there's that kind of, I kind of knew maybe it wasn't quite legal, but I didn't realise it would be getting this level so quickly. So potential lack of understanding seemed to be a very common theme that spread across the cyber criminals and their account of why they had engaged in it. The second theme really was that it was entertaining, it was challenging. They weren't in it for money, and that, again, it relates to one of the issues about why this is particularly problematic for the National Crime Agency, is that most on really you're trying to get something out of this. You might be looking to make money, or you might be looking to cause somebody harm, encapsulates the basis really of what the legal is structured upon. But a lot of these cyber criminals, they weren't doing it for money, and they weren't doing it to harm anyone. They just kind of found it interesting and they found it challenging. So the motivations are different, again, from more traditional crimes, which again is a bit of a challenge to the legal system, because the intent of why the person is doing it is an important variable. So the fact they were doing it for entertainment might get you a 10-year prison sentence if, obviously to go through the legal system, is a worrying contradiction for the National Crime Agency. There were also, as you might anticipate, with people with high levels of autistic-like traits, social issues, that negative influence of peers, a lack of a social group, and having a sense of self-importance potentially. And with that lack of social group, there's suggestions that maybe you might be using online groups, and maybe within there's capacity to develop your skills, but also people goading you. Forums within which, hacker forums, where you can start saying, oh, I got into the CIA or whatever, and you can start developing those kind of supports rather than more anchored social groups that might be, so you kind of got that echo chamber of everyone you're interacting with is now a hacker at some level, thereby kind of normalizing that experience. So feature in there as well. That sense of getting some experience, and also potentially bizarrely, I thought it would enhance my career if I hacked into a bank. Then they might give me. The banks say they absolutely won't do that, but it highlights that in terms of reasoning about this, getting in earlier and thinking about cybersecurity might be particularly important if this is a motivation for why you're engaging in this criminally behaviour. So having an interest to improve my skills, and it's a challenge to get in, so if I can hack in, then I demonstrably improve my skills. Lack of teaching, and yeah, this kind of applied experience that might help me get a job. Another key theme that emerged from the excuse or the reasons that people were giving for why they'd done it is the kind of anonymity of it, and the minimal perceived risk. I'm fine, I'm sitting at home, no one's going to know it's me. They do know, and this kind of sense of being detached from it being a crime. It doesn't hurt anybody, it's a victimless crime. But in fact, we saw from the figures how many millions of there are, but there's still that sense of, well, it's quite detached and no one's physically getting hurt, at least. So this sense of anonymity and risk was also a theme that emerged in people's accounts, and that there was actually a minimum risk of getting caught, and the whole sense of anonymity really supported the bravado in going on and doing these kind of activities. But actually, the National Crime Agency, because and you're leaving your digital traces everywhere, once they've got you, the evidence there is very solid. So the minimum risk is actually a misperception. Court, then all the evidence is there really to charge you. So life events and people reporting, well, there's been a whole range of adverse life events that I've experienced, and this might be more common across population generally, but kind of being immature as well, or lastly, as you see, they're kind of using it as a coping mechanism to, I was depressed, so it kind of helped with that. So the kind of things going on in my life that aren't great, and the fact that it was a challenge, and that was what my motivation was. So it's help ameliorating the kind of negative things that are happening. So lastly, there was one kind of moral reasons that was, I'm justified in doing this. I'm the kind of hacker who's they're kind of annoying that company, and they deserve to be brought down, and I'm the one to do it. A kind of moral crusade that could be going on. So sometimes I'm not so sure it is wrong. I think there is some moral imperative here to take on big corporations, and put them in their place. So, or expose big corporations and all that kind of case. So there was also that kind of sometimes a attempt to kind of justify those kind of things. So they were the overall narratives of cyber criminals had presented. So overarchingly, as again, these weren't autistic people. These are kind of high autistic-like traits people. So the implications for autism, I say potentially, although I'm relatively positive, in that high levels of autistic-like traits do seem to be associated with having higher levels of technical skills and very high levels of computer-related skills, particularly. When you're looking at people with higher levels of traits, they do tend to be more typically male, and they too tend to have challenging or challenged social capabilities and social cognition type of issues. So it does seem to appear like it might seem like autism is. But I think what our data is hinting at for the first time is that these issues might be associated with higher levels of computer skills, and high levels of computer skills might be associated with cybercrime. But it's autistic-like traits that seem to be the drive. And if anything, autism may well be a protective factor when it comes to the relationship between higher levels of autistic-like traits and cybercrime. So lastly, if we're just looking at potential future implications, if we look at the reasons why people are engaging in cybercrime and why the reasons people aren't engaging in cybercrime, that might be a good starting off point for thinking about how to pathways into cybercrime and how to try and divert people possibly towards cybersecurity. We keep being told how many potential job vacancies there are within the world of cybersecurity, and we have some experts in the audience about cybersecurity. So maybe there could potentially be a very good account and a convincing account here for, again, not everybody, obviously, within the autistic community is going to be interested in cybersecurity, but to open up the debate and say, well, actually, maybe there is a section of the autistic community who might be prime for developing that cybersecurity type role. So when you start, again, looking at the kind of reasons and why they didn't, and a lot of law enforcement kind of strategies anyway, just telling people things are wrong and things are illegal, have found in the past to not be effective. We've shown here within this group, the kind of high autistic-like traits group, they're saying, actually, I didn't know. So although generally just telling people something is illegal may well not be an ideal strategy, for those who are higher autistic traits, this kind of subgroup, being very clear what is and what isn't illegal could be a very good strategy, whilst that strategy might not generalize to crime across the board for all types of people. So of course then that methodology of, oh, it's clear, just say that hacking is illegal and you'll solve the problem. Of course, it's not that straightforward. What's sometimes called white hackers or black hat hackers, and the kind of hat you're wearing is identifying whether or not you're kind of doing it for bad purposes or whether you're doing it as in kind of ethical hacking kind of way, and then you have this sense. And then that's merging the black and white nature of whether hacking is wrong or not. It's clearly not so straightforward just to say hacking is wrong, and you can do undergraduate degrees in ethical hacking. So just the concept of ethical hacking might think, well, it's an ethical thing to do, and building up that sense of, I am the person who's taking operations. So that sense of having to be very clear about what is and what isn't illegal and the morals behind that, and why you might engage in those crimes, and attempting to prevent going down those strategies, and then reorienting towards cyber security type strategies would be the way forward, but I'm not trying to suggest that's going to be easy. It's going to be a very nuanced approach that we hopefully will be working together with the autistic community to make those messages as possible. And I shall finish there. Thank you very much. So, are there any questions?
If my son wanted to do a computer degree and I knew whether he had a formal diagnosis or not that he was autistic, how would I, as a mother, protect him from committing cybercrime?
Yes, that's a good question. Because when the National Crime Agency are, as I say, they tend to be bursting the homes and grabbing computers, and the parents are totally unaware of what's going on. They know their child is upstairs, they know he's on his computer, typically it's a he, and and they know he's on his computer. They have no idea what. And I suspect that might be the same for you as well. So what the National Crime Agency says is you have to be there. You have to be involved as a parent with what they're doing. And well, no child wants their parent looking over their entire time. Would you even understand it? Yeah, absolutely. And we were talking earlier about the digital natives and the digital immigrants. So the argument is on parents get skilled up, and the National Crime Agency have got a website, and they can let you know. I mean, would you know what your child was downloading? I mean, they do, and as soon as you start downloading the software that enables you to do these DDoS or these hacking type activities, alerted, so they know what's going on. So they can work with parents and they can share this with you. So they want parents to work with them. They've realised this is almost beyond a policing thing, and this is something that. So they want to know how can they help you and how can they work with you as parents, given that the children are clearly going to try and not share this information with you. But yeah, and that of course relates to all autists, all kind of, whether you're autistic or not. It's how as parents do we get more involved to kind of prevent this pathway into crime. So they are there, they can let you know if anything illegal is being downloaded that would enable crime. But it does mean working with them.
Contacting me?
If your son is downloading these things, they will contact you directly. And in fact, it comes with a warm, it's called a cease and desist warning, is your first stage, where they interact with you and say, this is what's happening.
Can you block it so I don't get it?
I don't know. No, they can't then start blocking your. But they will start saying, this is happening, you need to stop it. Because next time it won't just be a letter coming to your house.
I just wondered if there's other areas of cybercrime that you would be looking into in future. I'm thinking more around sexual exploitation or other things like that.
No, that is the old aspect. So this, as I say, this is the first study, and it was with the cybercrime unit of the National Crime Agency, because their focus is cyber-dependent crime. We're not looking yet, anyway, at cyber-enabled crime.
Do you know if Barclays have ever employed one of the cyber criminals to then test the security systems?
I don't know if they've employed cyber. They do have a cyber challenge where they invite people along to do all, not illegal activities, but a whole range of different cyber activities. And they have about 4 jobs at the end of this. So those who engage in the most successful with the cyber world are then offered employment. So not cyber criminals necessarily, but those who have the highest levels of computer-like skills. They have set up programs to try and say, first of all, come online and have a go at these tasks. And then if you pass those, then come in, and we have special days where we're having trials. So they're not interviews, but it's almost like a test of your abilities. And those who come out, as I say, top, are then taken forward to the next level.
Mm. Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Could I just ask, the information that you share today, do you share with things like youth offending teams that do who might be involved in cybercrime or might be enticed into? Is that kind of an initiative that goes on, or do youth offending not kind of get involved in this side of criminality?
Yes, we've in Bath, so it's actually in the Bristol youth offending team, and there was it wasn't a conference, but it was a kind of day together where everyone was kind of coming together, and we were trying to share these ideas, and then how you roll this out and what you do with it, what we're going to be taking forward. So yeah, absolutely, it's trying to get the impact to the people who are actually dealing with these issues.
Yeah, because I think for youth offend team that I've had involved, obviously they do get involved in crime, but I think cybercrime is something that's still hard to tackle. If the youth offend team aren't kind of up to date with all the technology themselves, it's kind of hard to, put into action that. if, they're still trying to catch up with the latest thing and, these kids are kind of off in the realms of wherever, really. So I just wondered if work was going on kind of more closely with that initial kind of referral to offending.
Yeah, and the training of the police officers as well, obviously, because we're all kind of playing catch up. And if you're going around to arrest someone for committing a crime that you don't understand, it's particularly challenging to rehabilitate or intervene with something and actually you don't understand. It's a bit like the question earlier. We're all kind of playing catch up, but that's the only way to do it. Really, is to catch up as far as we can.
You're saying that there's an obligation for us to become more savvy?
Well, those who are responsible for preventing crime and intervening with crime, it's very difficult if you have no idea what the concept of that crime is, and then dependent upon the word of the potential offender, whether they're committing crimes or not. So not necessarily everyone in the world, but we do need people who are able to intervene, who know what they're doing.
So should parents be like, to the kids, give us a look at that code, son, and okay, that's all right. That's you can carry on doing that.
Yeah. How many parents are able to analyse that code and see what's going on? Yeah. I mean, that highlights it's a nice example to highlight the difficulty of this. It's and it's not a UK problem. The world is struggling with this issue. How to skill up people to take on and deal with what 15-year-old boys are doing for fun. Okay. Well, thank you very much.